So John, a couple of news stories this week about a new IoT botnet. Do you have any info on that?
I do. So we've seen lots of different IoT botnets over the years, and this is actually about a year since the large Mirai botnet composed of a lot of IoT-based devices. But what some people are starting to report is there's another new variant of malware infecting IoT devices. One person's calling it IoT Reaper, and there's another group calling it IoTreaper. But they're basically the same thing. The interesting thing about this one is instead of trying to brute force password guess a lot of the common default passwords that these devices have, it's using a different tactic. It's got a list of about 9 different vulnerabilities for these various types of devices, and it tries to exploit them that way. So it's got a various suite of these different vulnerabilities, and it's scanning for devices that fit those categories or are vulnerable to those, and then it's compromising them and infecting them. So it's kind of a different approach instead of the...
know how it's scanning? Is it 423?
Actually, most of them are web-based vulnerabilities. Okay. Actually, I think almost all of them, although I didn't look at every single one, but if everybody hangs in for the internet weather, I actually have some charts kind of showing how this actually looks related to some of this activity in the internet weather segment once we get to it. Most of it is web-based traffic on various ports like 80, 81, 88, 8080, 8888, various things like that, as we're seeing the scanning on attempting to target these various vulnerabilities. Another interesting thing that we've seen, not exclusively this botnet, but it's got the Lua, which is a scripting language, built into it as part of its execution environment, which allows it to, when it wants to issue commands to the bots, it can do it in kind of a universal scripting language that they'll all be able to execute. And we've actually seen that with another family of malware called LuaBot that also infects IoT devices. I don't think it's the same actor as LuaBot, but it's interesting that there's some kind of borrowing of techniques here.
Yeah, it looks like there's some borrowing from Mirai as well. That part of the base is from Mirai, but also what I was reading is that it appears that the Mirai and Reaper can sort of coexist, whereas we've seen where other bots, it's one or the other. It looks like a device could have both of these, which is potentially frightening.
Well, that is true, and that's not actually unusual. Right. There's a lot of these IoT families of malware that will coexist on a single device together, but then there are some that will intentionally look for other popular variants of malware and try to kill it if it's on it. So it's the only, one on that device.
If they think that there's another family that's going to use up too much of the resources, because these are small devices, then they'll try to kill it so they have exclusive use. But if they're going to be kind of just working in the background and not, for example, launching huge denial of service attacks or anything, then they pretty much don't care if something else is also running on there at the same time.
The other interesting things about this malware is that they have built into it about 100 open DNS resolvers that are out there. What the purpose of that is hard to say, if it's for, reflective denial of service attacks or if it's just for resiliency, so it can get DNS resolution no matter where it is. Hard to say, but they haven't observed any DDoS attacks issued from this as of yet. It's definitely one that we should probably keep an eye out for. It's interesting in the way that it's recruiting new devices in, and that it's got a suite of vulnerabilities that it's targeting.
Right, it's not doing password and brute force password guessing.
As far as I've read, it hasn't. I haven't pulled the sample apart, but it's definitely scanning for specific vulnerabilities.
A couple of friends of mine have samples of this malware that they're starting to look at, and I'm hoping to have time towards the end of the week to reverse it myself. But keep your eyes open, because we should have more details on what it is that this is actually capable of doing here over the next week or so.
And Krebs' story links directly to each vendor's response with patches, so this is one of those that, at least since they've identified the main vendors that are being targeted, that there are some fixes out. So,
all right, great.
Fear the Reaper, right?
Right, fear the Reaper until next week. I don't see it right yet as being super large compared to some of these other botnets we've watched, but it's still early. So, I guess we'll see how it forms. Literally, we only kind of learned about it within the past 24 hours or so. So,
feels a little bit like, the calm before the storm, that this could be something that really puts us to the test in the next, weeks and months ahead.
So we got Jim Clausing online with us this week, and Jim, you're looking at a story about a novel way that some attackers are using to steal people's private SSH keys, it sounds like.
We see every week that SSH is in top 2 or 3 or 4 of the scanning on the internet weather, and most of the time what they're trying to do is brute force password guess to get in through SSH. But one of the ways that we normally try to avoid that is we tell people use public-private keys. They can guess passwords all they want. They'll never get in if you only allow public-private key authentication. Unfortunately, some people don't really secure their private keys as well as they should. So this story showed up a couple days ago on the securityaffairs.co blog, a report out of company WordFence. They specialize in trying to secure WordPress websites. And what they were seeing was a lot of scans in their logs, folks looking for, as you said, the private SSH keys. They were especially private SSH keys owned by root. If you make a mistake in the way you configure your website so that folks' home directories are browsable, you can find these, and unfortunately people have been finding them. Over the years, I've occasionally seen scans for SSH keys, but this seems to be a concerted effort.
Do we think there's a new vulnerability associated with this, or is there any particular reason that this harvesting would start? Any ideas?
No, it doesn't look like there's any vulnerability involved here. This just appears to be folks who noticed that some people mistakenly don't protect their private keys as well as they should. I mean, we've seen in the past where various keys get accidentally uploaded into GitHub and things like that. And I think this was just some guys decided to take a little closer look. They must have found some, otherwise it wouldn't have been worth their while to go about scanning other websites looking for the same kind of thing.
Right. It's like we did a story a couple months ago about scans for incomplete WordPress installations. Where someone was finding that if you start your WordPress install and leave it, that they can go finish it for you and configure it with backdoors and vulnerabilities, same kind of thing. If somebody finds that you've misinstalled your WordPress site with the SSH keys exposed, now, it's something to look for.
If somebody is using SSH to push their content out to their website, then they may have their SSH keys, and if they accidentally copy over both their public and their private, then that might be out on the web server. Not sure why else you would have your private key out on the web server. You'd want that on the system you're logging into it from. But
I think the vulnerability here is stupidity.
Yeah.
I actually never thought even to look for this, and after I read the story, I went to Google. And really quickly, I was kind of shocked to see how many private SSH keys are just accidentally exposed.
The analogy I keep thinking of is stealing a car by walking through a parking lot and looking to see if the door's open and the keys are on the seat.
I guess so. But even better than that, there's directories out there that have already indexed all the cars with their keys inside.
Yeah.
And you could just go right to that, red Chevy and steal it.
It's kind of one of those things that you shouldn't be doing. It's basically negligence, leaving your private SSH keys exposed to the internet. So anybody who's looking for your private keys can just, do a search and grab your keys.
I sometimes wonder if people actually really fully understand the significance of the key pairs and which ones are the important ones to hide. Because it's not always obvious especially if you're a new user, to using SSH and public-private key pairs. Definitely, this is an interesting technique to steal private keys and therefore be able to access other machines via SSH, which basically means you probably have ownership of that machine at that point.
Yeah.
So I guess the best way to detect if somebody else is noticing this is to monitor your logs.
Yeah.
ID underscore RSA or an ID underscore DSA or an ID underscore ECDSA is not a file that you would normally expect your web server to be serving up. So if you're finding requests for these in your web logs with a 200 success error code, then,
if you see evidence of people trying to fetch those, and even worse, if they try to fetch it and they get it, like a 200 OK response comes back, that would be a problem. So then that might be something you need to go run down really quickly, make sure those keys are changed and that file directory structure is protected from being able to be accessed just by anybody. I guess the bad guys never cease to impress me with the way they think laterally around how to do malicious things. So this is another good one in terms of creative, out-of-the-box thinking, in my opinion.
So Joe, there's a lot of talk about autonomous cars these days, and I understand you had a story related to that you wanted to share.
Yeah, so in SC Magazine, Edward Amoroso from Tag Cyber and Sharon Vardy from Pavoti, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but they put out an article basically creating this analogy between autonomous cars and autonomous application security. Basically trying to get you to understand the ramifications of automation with regard to application security, the same way you could kind of conceptually understand the need for security with an autonomous vehicle, self-driving vehicles. People can think about, okay, if this car is going to drive itself, it better know how to stop at a stop sign, and it better not be able to, get tapped in from the car in the lane next door to tell it to slow down, comparing that with application security. So the idea is for these applications to secure themselves. And I think we all know that there's some trade-offs there, and this is just, they've really done some thinking about how we should be thinking about what, automatic application security really looks like. So I thought it was interesting.
I actually think this is a really great idea. The problem, I think, is going to be that getting the software developers on board. Now, when people driving cars, we inherently understand the risks involved there, right? If something goes wrong, there's risk to life. Someone could die, or you could run into somebody else or cause other property damage, whatever. A lot of bad things could happen if an autonomous car goes off the rails. But to secure code, people who write the code need to feel that there's that same level of risk that if something bad happens here, if something goes astray, that it's going to be a catastrophic type of event. And I don't know that most of the software developers I run into, they just want it to do the functions it's supposed to do, not write all this insulating code around it in order to secure it. With application code, it's not quite as obvious that if you don't follow these principles and guidelines of securing your code and protecting it from these various types of outside threats or internal threats that could occur, that you're going to have the same level of risk there.
There needs to be a level of ownership and trust within the creator. So with the autonomous car, it's, the person creating the self-driving components and the checking of what's doing what, the sensors that are seeing what's around. And with an application, it's the developer. I agree. I mean, I work more on the development side, so I see that, there is a level of pride and, understanding of what you're creating that needs to be there, and security has to always be part of that. So
it's not an easy problem, because that's the way developers are always under the gun. They've got a deadline, and users want new features or whatever, and so taking that step back and thinking about the system as a whole and how to get it to protect itself is going to take some effort in changing the mindset of the developers and the folks who are asking the developers for all these features. It's a mindset change that needs to take place pretty much all the way down the line.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of what the writers of this story were saying, is that this is a topic that needs to be discussed, and people need to be able to conceptualize what automation really means. So that's why I thought it was a useful story, and gets us talking about autonomous application security. Maybe not the top of our list Maybe it's more 3-5 years down the road, but it's something I think to at least start a conversation about.
It's a lot different than driving a car. However, we have seen lots of, high-profile data breaches, some significant things happening over the past couple of years here that have cost companies to either dissolve in some cases or have serious setbacks in their stock prices. So, there's definitely some equitable correlation there in terms of the damage that can occur, especially, but you gotta get that pushed down and translated to the people, the ground troops who are actually writing this code, because typically what happens is the CSOs or CEOs are the ones who take it on the chin, not necessarily the person who introduced that vulnerability or bug in the code initially. So I totally agree that this is definitely something that's a good discussion to get started, because I think it's something that really needs to become part of just the day-to-day livelihood of software development in general. All right, so Joe, let's take a look at the internet weather for this week. There's not a lot of change from last week, and I'm going to focus on some more of the oddity ones in the top 10 than some of the ones we see all the time. So like the Telnet and SSH, we don't have charts on those this week because we know that there's lots of IoT-based scanning going on for that from the IoT-based botnets that are out there. 445 TCP is mostly WannaCry and some of these other families of malware. The two I was going to focus in on here is 53413 UDP and 8545 TCP, which are kind of oddball ones we don't see all the time. Web is one that's been scanned a lot lately, as well as Remote Desktop Protocol. And 443 TCP is HTTPS, which kind of crept up from the top 20 into the top 10 this week. In terms of the most sources probing, which usually indicates botnets type activity, because you get a whole bunch of sources at once probing for a specific port and protocol. We know we've talked about 23 and 22 are probably a lot of these IoT-based families of malware. 445 TCP is most likely WannaCry. The FTP one, we've talked about this a little bit. I didn't pull up a chart this week on it, but we know that there's a lot of actors out there looking for FTP servers to use for various purposes. But the one I thought was interesting that kind of crept up into the top 10 here is 81 TCP, and we're going to take a closer look at that one and why that one is in the top 10 this week when it hasn't been previously. So first of all, let's take a look at 8545 TCP. This is most likely related to the Etherium Wallet Bug. Okay. And we talked about this last week. I think Matt as well, when he did the internet weather, talked about this. Back on July 20th of this year, there was this vulnerability announced about the Etherium wallet, which is a piece of software that runs on your machine, and it's for holding your Ethereum cryptocurrency, which is a lot like Bitcoin. Right. Somebody found a bug, and they were able to steal $30 million of Ethereum, which is, I guess we kind of laugh. I don't have any Ethereum. Once that happens, so if you look here, this is July 31st, is right around here. So somewhere around here, around this July 20th timeframe, is when we first started to see lots of scanning. Prior to this, we don't really see any scanning on this port. And then there's been kind of a steady state amount of scanning going on. Not necessarily a lot of sources doing this, but they're doing a lot of scanning. Just a few hosts are involved here. In a previous show, I pulled a couple of samples from our honeypots, and there were actually requests from some of these scan sources that I was able to collect that show packet captures that look like they're actually looking for Ethereum wallets based on what they're querying for. So we're pretty sure that that's what's going on here, is more actors looking to see if they can find anybody who hasn't heard about this bug and is still using the Ethereum wallet as part of their software for maintaining that.
Has this been patched, or is it?
It has been patched. Okay. It was patched somewhere probably very close to around this time frame. But you know how that is, right? Not everybody gets the message and they don't know to update their software.
It looks like it's just getting worse, huh?
In terms of more probes, yes. I don't know that equates to more sources involved in that scanning. Yeah. But there's definitely an uptick in the aggressiveness and how much scanning has been going on lately looking for it. So let's take a look at the next one, which is 53413 UDP, which is a well-known bug from a long time ago. And I actually pulled this up as well last week. So from August 25th, 2014, this vulnerability was announced. Trend Micro actually put a story out about it, that the Netis router has a wide open backdoor. It's actually, we've talked about this on the show over the past couple of years.
Oldie but goodie. Here it is again. We're still seeing the Netis router we see ramp ups, botnet recruitment.
It's been around for over 3 years now, but we've seen another resurgence in scanning activity trying to recruit new devices into that bot using that vulnerability. And you actually look here, this is August 31st, 2014, and probably a few ticks before that is where August 25th happened. And it was only when this story came out that everybody got on, well, not I shouldn't say everybody,
So all
the bad guys got on the bandwagon and started scanning for this stuff. We saw, we've seen kind of ups and downs. This was a really big period back here last year around the July timeframe. Maybe early August.
I think the Netis router has become, like a standing story for us. It's something that we use as an example of IoT devices that are known to be bad, for lack of a better term.
It comes and goes. It's an interesting vulnerability because it's UDP, and you only need to send one packet to actually compromise the machine. So you could spoof your source IP, and as long as you have address space that you can spoof from, and it wouldn't even be attributable to you. You could compromise devices and the source IP isn't even yours. So there's a lot of interesting
So do you think
things about that.
The peaks in scanning could align with recruitment, or?
It could be, because I don't know what they're putting on when and we actually have captured some of these as well and showed them on the show, what they're trying to do. But usually they send kind of a bash script command that says either like wget some file and then run it, or a TFTP a file and run it, but you'd have to look at what the malware is that they're implanting on there to see if it tries to also scan. Well, hopefully most people have either addressed this or retired that piece of hardware for something new. But like we said, we know a lot of these types of devices, people just drop them on the network and they let them run. As long as they keep running, they don't really take any action to patch them or upgrade the firmware and whatnot on them, so they might be left vulnerable. But patches are available for this and have been for a very long time. Then the next one we have was on the top sources, scan sources, and this port 81 TCP had kind of crawled up into the top 10. And we talked about this before, a while back on April 24th, that there was a new IoT botnet spreading over port 81 on a large scale. A family of like a security camera that used the go-ahead web server software, and there was a vulnerability in there that you could pretty easily exploit. And this aligns very well here. So if you look again, this is about May 7th here is where this one word is here. Go back a little bit, that's right around the April 24th timeframe. We started to see lots of scanning. It kind of went down a little bit. I mean, it stayed up around, about 2,500 scan sources per hour, but it's jumped back up recently to about 5,000 scan sources per hour.
We had seen scanning on port 81 a while back, and we didn't really know exactly what it was. It turned out to be part of some botnet activity.
Notably in port 81 TCP, that one kind of jumped up into the top 10, and we looked in our honeypots, we could actually see some evidence of that. We have some insights into what that might be. There was a story that broke this week about another botnet called IoT Reaper, and we talked about it earlier on the program. This is a new family of malware that is scanning for 9 different vulnerabilities in various types of hardware here. So D-Link, go-ahead, so that same go-ahead vulnerability is in here, right? JAWS, Netgear, Vacron. These all listed on various ports, but I kind of consolidated them all to this list here. So it's either 80, 81, 82, 88, all these various ports here.
So do you think that the scanning we saw in April was an early indicator of the Reaper?
No. I think that the Reaper is somebody who said, hey, we know about a couple of different ones. Let me get all these different vulnerabilities together. I'm going to make a new family of malware that's going to go look for all these different vulnerabilities instead of just one that we knew about. And I don't have a strong analysis opinion, but I feel like this is a different actor set than the one from back in April. But
maybe using the same vulnerability.
Using the same vulnerability, as well as about 8 other additional ones against different types of devices to implant their malware on the device. So I thought it would be interesting. I said, well, let's go look in our honeypot and see what we have in here. And I could see these various things that I've highlighted in yellow, which is kind of the leading indicator, all coming in on port 81. And they are all for these exact same ones that were on the list here. So you have D-Link, you have the go-ahead web server vulnerability, Netgear, ReadyNAS, Vacron, NVR is this one, D-Link, and these are all different little tricks that they're doing to either get a config file or run a command.
But now with the IoT Reaper botnet becoming, a primary news item, interesting tie back to some of our previous work with internet weather.
This one's trying to run a shell command that's in the thing as well. So there's all these various vulnerabilities, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I got 9 of them here. 2 of them are for one type of device, I think D-Link or something like that. So they're all really represented in our scanning activity. And this is kind of, we started to see an uptick in this over the past week or so in our honeypots. So if you have these types of devices, these are a lot of consumer type of hardware, either D-Link for sure, Netgear, Linksys, AV Tech is a security camera, Go Ahead Web Server is one that's used on those security cameras as well, Vacron is another network video recorder. So if you have those types of devices, you definitely want to pay attention. Make sure you get those patched. I'm not positive, I believe all of these are patchable at this point. It's just a matter of people taking note and making sure that they patch these their hardware so that they're not vulnerable to this anymore. But I thought it was an interesting kind of corollary there that we actually have some evidence of an uptick in activity specifically targeting these various vulnerabilities. And while I show them here, I'm not really revealing any secrets. If you go to these pages on this website for this article, you'll be able to read about all these vulnerabilities in depth, in much more depth, about how they actually function for exploit purposes. So that's about it.
Cool, very cool. This week, we really looked at the future. Are we going to be thinking about the IoT Reaper the same way we think about the Mirai botnet? We're still going to be looking for vulnerabilities, everything from something small like exposing your SSH keys to something, really conceptual like, automation and machine learning and securing your application. So, this show today kind of made me think about, what are we going to be talking about 6 months, a year, 3 years down the road.